I have in front of me my watercolors and also my paper. I'm using an Arches block, and here is my reference. Right here are some sunflowers. This is just a nice reference with 3 different flowers and also some stems, so it'll be pretty nice to go ahead and paint from that. So you're going to want to start out with a medium-sized brush just to kind of get down some of your initial washes. You're welcome to go ahead and do a pencil outline. I like to do that when I do a painting, even when I'm doing a quick little sketch like this. But it's not necessary. If you don't want to, you can just go ahead and paint directly on the paper. Make sure if you do a sketch on watercolor paper that you do not press down really hard, because those pencil lines can be really difficult to remove once you have them down. Okay, so I'm going to take my medium-sized brush, and I'm going to use Hansa Yellow Medium right here, which is just a great yellow, very vibrant. Isn't that pretty? And I'm just going to mix a little puddle of this right here on my palette. And then I want to come and to paint directly on the dry paper. Now there's a couple of different ways that you can use watercolor. One is where you put down water first, and the other way is, that's what I'm showing you today, is where you just paint directly on the dry paper. You take your pigment here, a little puddle of paint, and then you start painting that down here. And I am painting in yellow for some of the shapes of these petals. And one thing you'll see about sunflowers is that those petals usually grow in a pattern, but also they often vary in the direction. This one over here is kind of curling upwards. This one's kind of curling down, and that's what makes this look realistic, is when you think about some of those petals going various directions. Now I'm also using the point of my brush to shape some of those petals. Okay, and then I'm sort of, outlining the shape and then coming in and just filling it in. Okay, so just working around fairly quickly, because I know that this wash is still wet, and I'll be able to come back in now and take a smaller brush this time. And I always like to check my subject and ask myself, what colors do I see? And there's usually more than one color in any given area, especially when we're painting something from nature. So I'm going to take some orange here, and I'm just going to now start painting some strokes of orange right around that center. That's where you're going to see some of the more darker color, is right around the center of your sunflower. There's actually little shadows in between some of those petals. So I can even take some of my Hansa Yellow and mix it in with the orange. So now we get a different, more orangey kind of yellow. And one little trick that I'll teach you about really making your painting stand out is it's good to use more than one shade in any given area. So I'm not going to just use one shade of yellow, I'm going to maybe use 2 or 3, because actually that's what makes it look more realistic. Okay, and you can see I'm doing these little strokes where I'm kind of pulling the color out, and I'm not worrying about it being too perfect, because I have that very light sketch that is underneath that is really helping me. Okay, and now I'm going to move over to some other colors. I have another color on my palette that I use a lot, and it's called Burnt Sienna. It's kind of a reddish brown, and that's going to be really good base color for me to use for the center of my sunflower. I'm going to dip my brush in some water right now and just come and paint right around here with some of that burnt sienna. And I'm sort of slowing down a little bit. I'm being careful to see how the 2 layers are blending together, because now we're working on a different part of the painting. We're actually working on the center, and before we were doing those petals. So I'm just going to take this point, go all the way around, take some more of my burnt sienna, just kind of fill in this little shape. Okay, there we go. So I have my center of my sunflower, and that's starting to look good. Now, another great thing about watercolors, you don't have to put down all your layers right away. In fact, if I want, I could let this dry off and then come back in with a second layer and perhaps go a little bit darker. So it's really depends on what you're painting. And in this case, I am going to take another color that I like to use on my palette a lot. It's called Burnt Umber, and it's kind of a darker brown, and it doesn't have as much of kind of that reddish tone in it. So I'm going to take a little bit of that and just maybe paint the center there of that sunflower, because I want to get more emphasis. So I paint a circle right there on top of the burnt sienna, and that's because the center color, the burnt sienna, is still a bit wet, so I can actually introduce another color and it'll blend and mix together. This technique that we just did is called wet into wet, and it's when you put one color down and then introduce another color and they kind of blend and mix on the paper. It's really fun. Okay, so now we already have that flower. We can move on and maybe work on this one. I'm gonna reach now for a bigger brush. Okay, I have lots of different sizes of brushes, but really when you're just starting out with painting, I recommend that you use a small, medium, and large brush. You don't need to have a whole lot of brushes, and some people, if they're really on a strict budget, maybe want to just start out with a medium-sized brush, and that's totally fine, like say a size 6, and then you can always, you know, buy those other sizes later on as you get more confident and you decide you want to expand some of your materials. Okay, so I'm going to make this little puddle here of some of my Hansa yellow and just take a little bit more water so that it's a little bit thinner. And then I want to work on this flower. Now notice that every flower that we're painting, even though it's the same flower, I like to look for different characteristics that make it a little bit more unique. So for instance, I'm seeing that these petals are facing up this way, whereas some of these petals are facing this way. And each petal is actually shaped slightly differently. So I try to put those unique things into my paintings. And I'm going to take the point now and kind of shape this, pulling this up. Might dip my brush back into the water just to get more of a watery consistency of paint. And then I'm coming all the way around and just painting these shapes in. And this is just our first layer. And we can see that some of these petals actually kind of folding backwards. And then we have some that are angled a little bit differently, maybe pointing up, and so I want to capture that in my painting. And then I'm going to show you also a shortcut too, is you can actually outline things when you're moving fast like this. And for instance, I might want to outline some of those, right? And then once I have the color down on the outline, I can actually take some more color and then just blend the color right in the center, sort of like a coloring book. Okay, and then I'll come back here, same thing, outline it. Okay, this is just one way that will help you move fast throughout your painting. And the reason for that is sometimes you want to move fast with one wash because you don't want it to dry off too much when you're using the wet and wet technique. You want to be able to come back in while it's still got a shine on the surface of the paper. That's how you can tell that that wash is wet enough for you to go ahead and add more color to it. So I'm going to dip my brush here in some Indian yellow, and then what I'm going to do is just start stippling some color right around the center, and see how beautiful that is with those two colors. They're almost very similar, but yet they're a little bit different. And having those two colors blending on the paper together is what makes I think the sunflowers start to really look more realistic. And then I'm kind of pulling it out just a wee bit. Okay, and also over here, just pulling it out. And this is where you can sometimes come back in and reshape some of those areas. Maybe I decided that I want to make this a little bit more pointy. So I'm going to come over here and just add that color. So there we go. There, it's looking good. Now I could always add a third color, so maybe I want to go into my orange, okay, and add that in, and then I'll just put some more strokes right here, and then maybe flick this out. By flicking, I mean taking the point of the brush and kind of pulling it outwards like that. Helps everything blend really nicely. Okay, so there we go. So there I have my sunflower starting to come together. Now I'm going to go back in, just like we did before, and take the burnt sienna, and I'm going to make a little puddle. This is my reddish brown. I'm going to start with this color first. The reason for that is this reddish brown happens to be my lighter brown, because I am planning to come back in and put the darker brown over the top. So here we are, just pulling this little stroke all the way around. And then in between here, pulling this out. Coming down here. And this really is fun doing these quick sketches, because you'll find that when you pick a subject you like and maybe you work on it for, you know, take a segment of time, maybe 15 minutes or half an hour a day. If you can afford that, I think it's a great thing to do just for relaxation. Remember, don't force yourself to work longer than that, especially if you're new to painting, because you want in the beginning just to work for small stretches and challenge yourself just a little bit. And that's what I like to think about when you're learning a new skill. Or if you have a schedule that's really busy, then perhaps just thinking about taking small little bite-sized pieces of time to work on your paintings, and that way over time you'll be surprised at what you can accomplish. So there we have burnt sienna. Now I'm going to go back in and take some of my darker brown. Now I really like the way that this is kind of blending and bleeding a little bit with the yellow. And I'm going to go in now and take some of my darker brown and then just paint that right on top, so that we get that emphasis in the center. And also this is going to mix and merge with the burnt sienna underneath, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so now it's time for me to allow this to completely dry. I'm really happy with these two flowers so far. And I'm going to take a smaller brush right now, and I want to show you how to get some of the details that we see on these leaves. I'm sorry, not the leaves, on the petals, because each of those leaves and petals do have different sort of details on them that makes them look real. Okay, so in this case, we don't want our painting looking flat. We do want to add a little bit of detail. I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to take my yellow ochre, which is a mix really of yellow and a little bit of brown, and I'm going to pull this color this way. Okay, it's real subtle. And now when I paint, I don't like to go around and outline every single detail, because I like to really just show the overall impression of what I'm painting. So what I will do is come in and just put these little strokes of that yellow ochre right in between here, pulling this out here. And now we're starting to see the division between some of those petals. Okay. Just on a few of those. Okay, there we go. And I'm also going to do this here. I might wait till some of this is dried off a little bit more before I really add more detail to that. And then I'm going to take now my small brush, okay, for this, and I want to take one of the colors that I really like to use a lot for mixing greens. It's called Sap Green. And I add a little bit of brown to it. Did you know that you can actually add a wee bit of brown to green, and it can actually give you a really nice natural brown, natural green? So peeking between some of these petals, you might see a little bit of foliage, and I'm just going to paint in this little wiggly line on either side and just fill it in with colors. So here is one of our leaves. Okay, and also here's another shape. Take a little bit of water on my brush, a bit more Sap Green. Just pull this down here. Okay, so there's our sunflower leaf. Now I'm going to show you another great technique that you're going to love. I'm just going to push my pad up a little bit so you guys can see. Sometimes what I like to do is add, say, yellow to green because it tends to mix and merge really nicely. See this? A little bit of yellow right there, and you can see that kind of blending. Because you will see different shades of green in leaves. So this is still wet, that layer, and I can see how that's blending really nicely on the page. And then I want to also go ahead and take a little bit more of this green here and show you how I paint in the stems, pulling some of the paint down this way. And then I'll do the same thing where some of these stems might be going the other direction, right there. So there we have just a few stems, so everything kind of connects together really nicely. And then I'm going to move on and work on this particular flower, sunflower. Now we can see the center of this flower is facing us, whereas these other ones are facing other directions. So I'm going to now reach again for my brush here. Let's take some Hansa Yellow Medium, a little puddle, and I'm going to use the tip of my brush. Notice how I am actually not just painting a perfectly round circle, I'm actually wiggling my brush up and down, because when you paint the center of a flower, even though it is a circle, okay, it still might have a little bit of an irregularity to it because we're painting something from nature. And here I am taking some more of this color, and I'll show you how I can outline some of those petals and then start to fill it in with the yellow. And you can go faster once you practice this. You can outline those shapes, especially when you've got petals that are pretty similar as far as their shape all the way around the center. Okay, and it helps also to have a drawing underneath when you want to go a wee bit faster. So here I am just outlining this, and then I'm going to take my Hansa Yellow and just fill it in. Just fill this in, and this petal is actually facing over the center there. And it's interesting, I think, to see petals kind of facing different directions. Looks so much more real. Here I am just filling it all in, and there we go. And here comes the really fun part, is where we get to go ahead now and add some of those different yellows. So Indian yellow is, or New Gamboge, those are both yellowish orange shades of yellow that I have on my palette, and they can be really good to use with Hansa Yellow. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and allow some of that color to mix and blend, kind of pulling it out all around here, and you can see that slight contrast of color. So there we go. All right, it's starting to look good. Now I can go in and take again my burnt sienna, which is my reddish brown, and we can put the color in the center. Right. So I'm going to go ahead and just paint this. Okay. So one of the questions I get a lot about watercolor is when people are new to it, they'll often say, how do I avoid my colors from getting muddy? And I think that in the beginning you may find that that might be a wee bit of a challenge with watercolor, but don't worry about it, because the more that you practice and learn techniques, you really can find a lot of ways to control watercolor. And now take, for instance, this center. I know that the yellow is going to blend in a little bit with the brown, but because I've worked with watercolor for a while, I really can sort of predict almost how much it's going to blend. Now, if I thought that was going to blend too much, what I might do is leave that little tiny gap right there, because I may want to have those places be completely separate on the painting until it dries, and then I can come back and swipe that edge, and that way I can stop or have more control in a sense, so I don't get that blending. But in this case, I love some of the spontaneity that we see with watercolor, where sometimes it does little things that you don't know what it's going to do. It's very spontaneous, and like I said, once you work with it for a while, you can almost predict how much it really is going to spread. And I love the effect of the yellow kind of blending into the brown, so I'm definitely going to allow that to happen. All right, so we have that, and of course I'm going to go back now into my darker brown and just start painting, stippling really some of that paint right around the center, because a lot of times when you look at sunflowers, you'll definitely see that they do have kind of a darker, almost a chocolate brown color for the center. So here I am just pulling that around in here. Okay, definitely starting to come together. And I'm going to go back now and take my small brush, and this is yellow ochre, which is a great color, and really is yellow with just a touch of brown. But it's one of the colors that I have on my palette because I use it a lot, especially when I'm painting subjects from nature. And I'm going to paint directly now on top of the wet paint, and I want you to see the difference. If I paint on a layer when it's dry, it will have a sharp line. If I paint on, say, a wet layer, I'm going to get that really nice fuzzy blend. So it really depends on the effect that you want to get when you're painting with watercolor, and both are important to your paintings, and I use them for different places in my work. All right, so I'm almost done with this layer, this particular sketch right here. And what I'll do is, usually when I work on a quick sketch with students, I'll do that maybe for about half an hour to 40 minutes at the most, and allow those layers to completely dry off. And then after that, what we'll do is come back and work on that final layer to kind of add maybe a couple more leaves or some more key details, and then that's the finish. So that's really my approach to painting in watercolor. So that's pretty much all we have for today's lesson.